Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. We're just giving folks a minute or so to jump on the line, and then we'll get started. If you're just joining us, we're just giving folks a minute or so to connect, and we'll get started shortly. If you're just joining us, we're just giving folks another 30 seconds or so to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump into some housekeeping while folks continue to join us. But good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, From Surveys to Solutions, Leveraging Feedback to Power Community Engagement. My name is Melissa Keene. I'm the Director of Enterprise Programs and Special Projects here at ILG, and I'll be your host and moderator for this afternoon's webinar. So a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to jump in and do a little bit about ILG and some context about why this is important and why we're having this conversation and how community engagement can build trust. And then we're going to jump into some presentations from our panelists and really hear about a great case story from the City of Yorba Linda on how they use surveys to collect data and really increase that trust and community engagement around a specific project. So we'll do a deep dive into that while we also sprinkle in some other tips and best practices on community engagement, on surveys, on data collection, et cetera. And then we will have time for Q&A at the end of today's session, and then we will wrap up and adjourn by 3 o'clock. So in terms of housekeeping, if you're just joining us, you probably noticed that you're muted, and you will be muted for the duration of today's webinar, but that doesn't mean you can't interact with us or ask us questions. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question at any point during that session, please type in into that Q&A box. And we will answer real time on logistical questions. And then if it's more substantive, we'll pull that into our queue for the Q&A session that I mentioned we'll have towards the end of today's webinar. You also probably noticed that we're recording. So we will be sharing the recording of today's session along with the slide deck and other materials that we reference in the next week or so. So keep an eye out for those materials shortly. A quick overview about ILG in case you're not super familiar with us, but we are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of the League of California Cities and the California State Association of Counties. So we've been around for about 70 years now, and our mission is to serve and support local governments like you all on the line. And our goal is to really provide practical and easy to use resources so that local agencies can more effectively implement policies on the ground. And we do that in a number of ways. We do a lot of education and training, like today's webinar, and conference sessions, and in-person trainings, and virtual trainings. But we also do technical assistance and capacity building and convening services for local agencies statewide in a number of different issue areas. So you see our four main pillars on the left-hand side of your screen there. So we do work in leadership and governance, workforce development and civics education, sustainable communities, and public engagement, which is going to be the basis of today's webinar. So if you aren't familiar with us, please check out our website. We have a lot of free resources available to you, free webinars, free written resources, case stories, best practices, etc., that you can use on this topic and a number of others. And we'll share some additional trainings and resources that we have coming up with you all at the end of today's session. So before we jump into the conversation and case story and deep dive on today's topic, I just wanted to level set and kind of set the stage and context with you all about kind of where we are in the world right now and why we at ILG see this topic of community engagement as so important for our local government partners, for our community partners, et cetera. So why does trust matter? So trust is the currency of democracy. And while local government remains the most trusted level of government, which we'll see on the next slide in a little bit more detail, without trust, it really impacts your ability to effectively implement policies on the ground. So it's harder to adopt policies that you might need to move your city or county or special district forward. You're going to see lower community satisfaction, declining civic engagement, and that's going to show up in a number of ways. People aren't going to participate in your processes. They're not going to complete your surveys. They may or may not come to your community meetings, but they will come if they're frustrated and upset, right? So I'm sure you all have seen those in your council and board chambers, your social media feeds, a number of different areas where folks are coming out to express their lack of satisfaction. So we want to think about this community engagement conversation is also a trust building conversation. So some key drivers of trust are just some data to share with you all as we jump into this conversation. So I'm sure many of you are aware that local government is the most trusted form of government and has historically been the most trusted form of government. And we sit at about 50% right now of folks saying that they trust their local governments in comparison with about 30% who say they trust the federal government. So while this is a positive note and data point for you all as local governments, the trend lines we've been seeing is that number is dropping. And so while still a positive note as compared to other levels of government, just something to also think about in terms of how do you continue to maintain and build that trust with your communities. We're also seeing increased levels of divisiveness and polarization, which I don't think will surprise anybody on the line. According to some data research done by Pew, polarization has doubled in the last decade. And that's also manifesting in our local governments, at meetings, and social media, and just public conversations, et cetera. And then you're coupling that with a decline in reputable news institutions. So over 250 local newspapers have lost circulation in the last few years. So you're seeing fewer historic newspapers and news sources, and folks are relying more on things like social media or like blogs or podcasts or AI-driven articles or things of that nature, which is going to impact how they get their information and what information they're hearing. And something else that I think is interesting as part of this conversation and part of conversations around community engagement is this negative recall bias. So people are going to remember bad news 5 times stronger than good news. So that's also going to be reinforced in what you're hearing and the takeaways that folks have from engagements with you and with your city or county or district. So just something to think about in terms of trying to make those interactions good, trying to tell those good stories, and trying to engage proactively and positively with your community. And then I'm sure this will surprise nobody on the line, but dissatisfied residents are 3 times more likely to provide feedback. So those folks that are coming to your weekly or biweekly meetings of your governing body, again, engaging with you in surveys and social media, things like that. If they're angry or they're dissatisfied, they're going to be 3 times more likely to share that with you than if they've had a good interaction with your government, with your staff, et cetera. And so to put a California context on this, Cal Matters also has fairly recently came out with information that hostility against public officials is rising in terms of harassment, recalls, threats. So if we have any electeds on the line, I'm sure that resonates with you. But even staff, I'm sure you're seeing some of that in your agencies and with your elected officials. Federal and state policy turbulence. So budgets are complex, mandates are hard to understand, executive orders are coming fast and furious and can be challenging to navigate. And all of this is going to confuse your residents. A lot of the topics that you all deal with on a day-to-day basis, and today's example that we're going to talk about is a prime example of this. But they're complex, kind of in the weeds topics sometimes that are going to be challenging for residents to understand and engage with without any context, without any education, without any of that kind of baseline data that you all have as local government staff and officials and leaders. So thinking about that as a key part of these conversations and making sure that you're building in time to do that is going to be really important for them to be able to engage with you in the way that you want them to engage with you. And then this again, I don't think will surprise anybody, but social media um, has really increased the spread of misinformation and can spread misinformation 6 times faster than facts. So just again, some things to think about in the context of local government, in context of California, and the world you guys are all navigating through. So the good news is that effective community engagement can help. It can help with some of these challenging things that you all are trying to work through, that your community is trying to work through. So in our experience, some of the key benefits of community engagement you see on the screen right now. So it allows you as local governments to better identify the values, the needs, the priorities, the recommendations of your community as you're building policies, as you're building plans, as you're building even general plans or housing elements or parks. Across the board, it can really help you figure out what your community wants and needs. As I was just mentioning, building in that educational component can also lead to more informed residents. So they will not only be able to better engage with your processes and with you, but they'll hopefully have a better context of how local government works and the hard work you all are doing and the trade-offs you're making on a day-to-day basis. It can lead to more improved decision making for you all as government agencies. Um, so you're taking that information, that baseline information from your community and what they need, what their lived experience is, and applying that to the decision making that you're working through, which can be a really great thing. Can lead to greater community buy-in and support, which is another tenet of something you'll hear throughout today's webinar. But involving folks from the beginning, getting their thoughts, getting their feedback, explaining the parameters that you're operating within, keeping them updated on timelines and ways that they can engage, can lead to that greater community support and buy-in, which can mean faster project implementation. And then the underscoring kind of value here is that it builds trust with your community and helps go back to that where I started in terms of, local government is still the most trusted form of government. So how can you build that trust and maintain that trust? And authentic and proactive and strategic community engagement is one of those things. It can also help you reach diverse groups of folks. And I think this is something that we'll hit on a few times here as well. But your outreach strategies, your public engagement efforts, and strategies and plans can really help you reach the breadth of your community and not just those folks who are dissatisfied and going to show up at your community meetings and your council or board meetings. But a couple of tips on things to think about as you're trying to reach diverse groups and the folks in your community is thinking about who's going to be identified, or sorry, who's going to be impacted by the decision that you're making. Are there specific individuals or groups that are going to be impacted by the effort or disproportionately impacted by the effort? Identify important locations and events. Do you know where your community groups are gathering? Can you go to them? Can you share information? Can you share your surveys? Can you share additional opportunities to engage? Can you use that as a platform to share updates and get feedback back from your community, particularly under-engaged parts of your community? Assess the effectiveness of your communication channels. Are there certain ways that your community gets information? Are they very social media savvy? Are they an older population that still relies on mailers and things like that? Do you have a really great website presence and newsletter list that you can engage with? So what sources are they engaging with and what languages do they use? And do you need to be thinking about interpretation and translation as you're going through this? And then consider relationships. Think about who you know in your communities. Who are those trusted ambassadors? Who can you work with through community organizations or nonprofits or others to help get your message out, to help increase your reach? And is there any history within the community that needs to be acknowledged? So what's happened before? Are there strained relationships with certain parts of the community and your agency? How can you start to navigate through that and again, rebuild that trust as needed? So these are just some of the things I wanted to share from where we sit and what we've seen work through our work with local agencies in the community engagement space before we jump in and have a deeper dive. So with that, I'm excited to introduce the rest of the panel that we have with us today. So I'm joined by Allison Estes and Nate Farnsworth from the City of Yorba Linda. Richard Bernard from FM3 Research, and Ryder Todd Smith with Tripepi Smith. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them to share again a great case story about how this works and how data can inform community engagement and how it can increase your ability to do good things in your community.
Awesome, Melissa. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with ILG today. ILG is a critical institution of local government in California, covering special districts, the counties, and cities. And through my decade of involvement with ILG, I've always been impressed by the team there. So I appreciate you giving a chance for us to bring this project to light and talk about it with the local government community here in California. If we go to the next slide. So we're going to be discussing surveys to solutions. And I would just note, like, surveys are certainly a key component of this, and they are part of a broader outreach effort that involves a ton of community engagement. And this case study in the city of Yorba Linda was so significant in my experience and the work that I've done in local government that it really redefined the mission and vision of Tripepi Smith. Based upon kind of the outcomes of this effort, and more importantly, the quality experiences I had throughout the process of engaging with the average citizens who just want to build better communities for themselves, and the consequence of bringing those folks into the fold as much as possible and having authentic resident engagement. And you're going to see why here in a second, what we mean by that. So this is really a backdrop with an incredible story and some dedicated city staff who took a trust fall into the arms of their residents, and I think it worked out pretty incredibly. Next slide. The context here is essentially this slide. In 2022, there was a ballot measure, and we'll have more context in 1 second, but fundamentally a ballot measure that was addressing increasing housing density to accommodate state-mandated housing RHNA numbers. The measure in 2022 failed, with only receiving just under 25% of the vote in support of the residents of Yorba Linda. And through extensive community engagement, discourse, conversations, public outreach, survey research, and a litany of other efforts, when that ballot measure came back up again in 2024, it was supported by nearly 91% of the community. And in my experience, being proximate to city ballot measures, I have never seen a shift like this in my life. And a lot of the credit goes to the city of Yorba Linda for being innovative and willing to put it all out there to try to move the needle and engage in authentic resident engagement. And that's going to be the story we're going to talk about today, is how you have that kind of significant shift in the public perception of an issue to really change the worldview for folks, or give them a chance to be involved in that decision. So with that, I'm going to throw it to the next slide and invite Allison and Nate to kind of put some context and explanation of the challenges that the city of Yorba Linda was facing. Nate and Allison?
Sure. Thanks, Ryder. And this is Nate Farnsworth. I'm the city's community development director and was the project manager for the project that we're talking about here. We'll go to the next slide, and I'll just give a little bit of context about the city of Yorba Linda. I'll let Allison jump in if she'd like to on any of these in case I forget anything. But Yorba Linda, we're located in Orange County, Northeast Orange County. We border up next to Riverside County and San Bernardino County. And we are a city of about 70,000 population. We are primarily a bedroom community, mostly single family homes. We do have a small handful of commercial centers throughout the city. So as we were talking about rezoning land to accommodate these housing mandates from the state, one of the concerns that we had was potential loss of commercial centers, which is a huge part of our local economy here. We also pride ourselves on the number of parks that we have. We've got a lot of open space that's restricted land. So these all became really big challenges as we were trying to accommodate the state's housing mandate requirements for the city. Let's go to the next slide. One of the unique things about Yorba Linda that I think is unique to most other cities is that we have what's called, we commonly refer to or affectionately refer to as Measure B, which is really the Yorba Linda Right to Vote initiative. In 2006, the voters put an initiative together that required that any sort of major rezoning effort that increased density within the city would be required to go through the voters for their approval. So not only does it require council approval, but it has to be put in front of the voters. So with these state housing mandates, it couldn't just be the city deciding to make whatever changes. We had to put that in front of the voters and have them approve that as well. So this caused a lot of resistance from the community. Like I said earlier, this is a community that's primarily single family homes, and the residents of our community take pride in that. They don't like to see significant change within the way that the city is. When they purchased their homes, they bought into a community that was a certain way, and they like it that way. And that's why they've moved to Yorba Linda. And so that's made it a challenge in trying to accommodate the state's requirements for housing need. The community is also, not only are they very engaged, they're also very educated, and they organize very well. And so this results in us needing to be extremely transparent in the way that we reach out to the community on things. Because if we don't, past experience has shown that they will call us out for it. So let's go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, and I'm going to just assume that most people here are at least somewhat familiar with RHNA, which is the state's housing mandates for each local jurisdiction. Can certainly get into more detail on that, but I think the basic summary of it is that every city is required to provide a certain amount of land to accommodate a certain number of housing units that's required by the state. And for the purposes of today's discussion, really, it's not so much the importance of what RHNA is, but how we were able to work with the voters and move from a majority not being in support to a majority being in support of what we were proposing to do in order to meet the state mandates. It was really important that we come up with a plan that would meet not only state law, but also get past the voters. So fine balance between the two. We recognized and helped the voters to recognize that without a certified housing element, there were a number of consequences that would come from that, none of which were good consequences. And so it was really important that we come up with a plan that met state law that the residents could get behind and support. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we made our first attempt on our own as a city. We had actually done this previously during our fourth and fifth housing element cycles, where we were able to get the voters to support our efforts to rezone land. We thought we would use the same process that we used during those housing element cycles, and it failed. It failed pretty miserably. 75% of the voters did not support the rezoning that we were proposing to do. There was a lot of community distrust and a lot of misinformation being spread around with social media, and also residents just pushing back on the city to want us to try and do more to fight the state's mandates. And so let's go to the next slide. What we found out at the end of all of this is that there are a number of things that didn't go well with Measure Z. The first one is this is an extremely complex topic. Lots of different state laws, lots of state laws that have changed since the last time that we did this. Our number that was from the state was significantly higher than it's ever been. So helping the public to understand what RHNA is and its consequences was extremely challenging. The state also, and this didn't help at all, they moved the goalpost for the deadline shortly after we had gone through all of our public outreach and efforts, which then resulted in the public saying, why don't we take more time and not push this through right away? But let's wait and see what happens. And so we had already scheduled our vote to go forward, and that narrative was being spread around. Mentioned social media and some of the challenges that were there, but all in all, it just became there was just a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding on a very extremely complex topic, and in the end, it resulted in a 75% vote failure in 2002. And let's jump to the next slide. I think so. I think I'll pass it over to Ryder to really help walk through how did we get from this 2022 vote of 75% saying no to over 90% saying yes in just 2 years later. So Ryder, do you want to take over from here?
Sure, Nate. Happy to do that. We'll go 2 slides forward.
And I may jump in too.
Please do, Nate. I welcome it. This was a joint approach, but fundamentally, the city after that defeat said we need to reset and start over, and ask ourselves, what if we started with residents first, and start with them as being the source of ideas for solving this problem, right? Because fundamentally, from the city's perspective, as much as this was the city's problem, it was the community's problem to get through and work through. And so let's make the residents a part of that process. And we also knew that it was going to take a lot of work to turn average residents into little miniature planners to understand all the complexities and nuances of state housing law to bring them into discussion. But if we didn't do that, we were probably going to fall short. And finally, we also knew that it was critical to bring the strongest opponents to the table as part of the conversation to ensure we had diverse voices at a table and see if we could make sure we were hearing from them directly about why they opposed prior efforts to make sure that any policy development we were doing was sensitive to their particular concerns. Next slide. So this concept was created of doing a trust fall into the community's arms and creating a housing policy resident working group. And fundamentally, this was identifying 17 residents throughout the community. These were identified by city staff, not by city council. These were not political appointees. These were essentially, like, almost, you could say, formed as a focus group of sorts to understand and hear from diverse voices. They were actually located all throughout the city. So we had geographic diversity represented in that. And we also made sure that, just given the sense of interaction with some of these residents who had been actively vocal on prior housing issues, we had a sense of where they were for or against the prior measure, which meant we had an opportunity to make sure that within the room, we didn't have an echo chamber, but instead we had lots of different viewpoints and ideas in the room that would help, frankly, make for a stronger group who could have some real deep dialogue and civil disagreement with one another to help us better understand the perspectives. And most importantly, as we pulled that group together, we asked them to commit to about 6 hours of meetings. It ultimately turned into 12 by their own choice. They had to commit to the time, and they had to be willing to show up and do homework and really do what it takes to roll up their sleeves to get their hands dirty on policy. And fortunately, they all jumped on board, and we had very high participation rate from everybody throughout the duration. Next slide. So it was important to know that we didn't go in with any expectations with the group. This was really creating a format to bring diverse voices together and say, look, this may turn into something or nothing. We don't know. Our job from a city side was to give them access to information, experts, resources, and also to just provide a facilitated experience to move the dialogue forward. And if we could get to consensus and move forward, great. And if we didn't, worst case scenario is we had a really healthy dialogue with some residents, and we gained more perspective on what went right and what went wrong with the prior ballot measure and how to move forward. But we discussed extensively why Measure Z failed. We went into great detail about the pros and cons of having a certified housing element, the consequences of not having one, all the history and background that was required. And then Nate spent a significant amount of time going through Housing Element 101 to really explain how housing works, how the housing element works, and going through spreadsheets and data to bring them all along for the conversation. And I think one key thing was the ability of the residents to ask their questions directly of experts in the room and get an immediate answer, which is a far better experience than, say, being at a council and then standing up for 3 minutes at the council meeting to express your frustrations with a particular process. This was much more of a back and forth and conversation. So we went through, we can go to the next slide. We went through 6 meetings of 2 hours each in length. These were evening meetings with the working group, and we ultimately did achieve consensus with that group. It took several weeks to get there, but they provide lots of feedback. We used a shared Google Doc to start drafting up a document of shared principles and ideas and priorities and concerns, as well as shared facts. It was very clear that no one member was fully satisfied with the outcome, right? There wasn't somebody who like declared victory. I think everybody in the room recognized they all gave a little something. And as one of the WISE committee members said, the ultimately recommendations they made were the least worst solution possible, which I kind of smile at, but it was just the tacit acknowledgement that there were state mandates that were driving this, and we had to work our way through to find the best possible solution to meet those state requirements and also preserve the kind of priorities of the folks that were in that room representing the diversity of viewpoints in Yorba Linda. But we did achieve significant consensus on facts, planning principles, findings, and really formed a modified housing element concept that did identify specific sites that, if upzoned to the identified increased densities, would help achieve compliance with state mandates. Next slide. So among those things were these high-level recommendations, and I won't go through each one of these, but we ended up with unanimous consent and agreement to these basic principles. And doing that and creating that framework of agreeing to these principles, it gave us momentum and energy to advance a much more extensive document that really outlined the totality of the work product of the working group, and also set some guidelines for city staff and the city council to adhere to the grassroots ideas that had emanated from this citizen working group and put them into action for the community. And in fact, I would just say, if you go visit yllocalcontrol.com, you can go visit that website to this day, and you'll find everything we're talking about here is actually detailed on that website. So there's plenty of information available. And this was actually a partner or a resource website we brought along the entire process to bring transparency to the outreach and engagement efforts throughout the process. And then let's go to one more slide. And Nate, maybe I'll turn it to you. If you could just talk a little bit about advancing this policy through to at least get it to the point where we could take it to the community, that would be great.
Yeah, you bet. So after all of that effort with working with this small resident working group, we took those recommendations to the city council and said, you asked us to do a trust fall exercise. Here's where it's at. The council didn't have any strong concerns with the recommendations that were coming from the residents. In fact, they were very pleased that the residents had come to consensus on some type of a plan, and there were no major red flags with it. And so they said, this looks good. Why don't you take that out to the community, and let's do a series of public outreach efforts with the community and see if we can get any additional feedback. Let's turn over every stone and see if we've missed anything. And so we did that. Ryder, I can't remember if we list in here how many meetings we did, but we did a lot of meetings with the whole community. And we did. We got additional feedback, and then eventually took that feedback back to the council, back to the working group, fine-tuned it, tweaked it a little bit more. And that was our effort. But it was like 30 plus meetings that we did throughout the community with various stakeholders and community-wide meetings and all of that. You want me to go into any more detail on that, Ryder?
No, I think that's great. I actually have a whole engagement section here I'm going to talk about to explain some of that outreach work that was done, because one of the things that was super unique here was this effort of a trust fall into the citizen group to let them dive so deep and spend so much time working through these issues and making recommendations to council. And I credit the Yorba Linda City Council having asked for this to happen. For them going with it and saying, we're going to listen to our residents on this and let this be a citizen-driven process to get it to the end game. And I think ultimately that was a critical aspect of trust building, as Melissa was talking about earlier, to bringing this forward to the community. And that was absolutely critical. Let's go forward a slide. So I want to talk real quick just about some of the blocking and tackling that was done as part of the city outreach strategy. Because it's one thing for this citizen working group to meet, but clearly that great work product on their part needed to make it out to a broader community conversation. And that really involved a big 18-month timeline to get there. So we'll go to the next slide. We had kind of two phases to this 18-month timeline. From April of 2023 until July of 2024, we were looking at the revised housing element education and formal approval. So somewhere in that process, we had to adopt a housing element again and send those revisions up to HCD and get HCD to sign off on this revised housing element plan because there was really no point in forwarding the plan to the community for ballot approval unless we had HCD approval. So that happened in early July, and then July 2024 is when the city council actually voted to place a measure on the ballot. And then we were able to advance through the ballot phase of the outreach. And this would be very similar with any kind of ballot effort campaign where you have a public engagement, public education phase generically about issues, and then your council is going to take action to put a measure on the ballot, and then it becomes much more focused of a campaign of a outreach and education effort specific to that particular ballot measure. As Nate mentioned, in the course of this effort, we delivered 32 community meetings and public hearings. Those community meetings were a format where it was primarily Nate or myself standing in front of a room, going through a standardized PowerPoint deck, answering questions, really getting into some nitty-gritty detail with residents. And interestingly, throughout most of those meetings, there were members from this resident working group who had participated in all the background research and information, who would stand up and offer their own viewpoints about why certain recommendations were being made or certain challenges were being faced by the city in trying to address this. Throughout that process, we also benefited from 2 statistically valid surveys conducted by FM3, one of the leading survey providers in the state of California. And we have Richard Bernard from FM3 to talk about that momentarily. We did a dedicated website, the Wild Local Control website, and we also did all sorts of direct mail and digital outreach work. So we were capturing people through multiple mediums, including many of the powerful mediums that Allison had developed. Because Allison leads communications at the city. She had a bunch of incredible platforms for us to also engage in the resident outreach process and make sure we could bring them along for the communications on this. Next slide. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details here. This PowerPoint deck, I'm sure, will be made available to you all, or you can screen grab this as you go along. But this is a much more detailed outline of just all the various steps in outreach work that was done as part of our effort to engage and communicate with the community throughout this process. We'll go to the next slide. This was a multi-channel effort. So as I mentioned, we had a website, we used social media, we used direct mailers. So people got mailers to the door. There were email newsletters that were sent out, both specific to the Wild Local Control website, as well as just using the city's general email newsletter format that they had. We talked a lot about our workshops and community meetings where there was ample opportunity for community engagement and Q&A conversations. And again, getting face-to-face with people was a super important part of building trust around an area where there was a lot of concern. And then finally, we produced a ton of animated videos. We produced a couple animated videos explaining the background on Housing 101 and how that works, as well as Builder's Remedy and explaining that so that we could try to help the rest of the community understand the complexities of this issue and some of the key terms that go along with housing policy in the state of California. Next up. And then we were always focused first too on, consistent with this engagement process we had with our working group, was lead with education first. So the goal was start explaining basic concepts and facts and put that plain language explanation in front of residents so they could understand the policy issues and the challenges. This included, as you can see some of the graphics on here, graphics explaining what density looks like. What does 5 units per acre versus 20 units per acre versus 40 units per acre look like? And maybe some of those developments already existed in Yorba Linda, so they had context for understanding what that might look like. Or if it didn't exist in Yorba Linda, where nearby might they go take a look at it to get a sense of what that kind of scale or sizing meant? So we were really trying to focus on just anticipating and listening to the types of questions that come up throughout this process and giving folks an opportunity to have access to materials to answer those kinds of basic questions that would come up. And then we'll go next. And this was all benefiting from having statistically valid survey data, which I really kind of view as one of the most significant forms of community engagement, because it's literally going out and asking 300 to 600 people a bunch of standardized questions. And for this, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Richard from FM3 to discuss statistically valid survey work.
Thanks so much, Ryder. So our charge was not only to test the viability of a measure, but also develop legally permissible ballot title and summary. That's 75-word ballot title and summary that's required, though in Orange County, they don't count the title, so we're actually able to include more words if someone's counting words later on. Also test a legally permissible educational roadmap. What can we tell residents that resonate with them about the process, about potential measure that will help inform them and make whatever they think is an educated decision. As you know, the city can't advocate, but they can educate. And also, our charge was to work closely with the city and Ryder as the outreach consultant to enhance their efforts of addressing the community. Next slide. So to accomplish this, we developed a survey of likely November 2024 voters. Those are the ones that were critical in deciding whether the city can fulfill its statewide obligations. We developed the survey by asking a number of different area questions. We wanted to first get a sense of awareness of the 2022 ballot initiative. Often our clients, such as the city, think, oh my God, we talk about it all the time. Everyone we know talks about it, so everyone must know about it. In actuality, the election was a gubernatorial November election. Less people turn out than in a presidential turnout election. And so therefore we anticipate a swath of voters who had never even heard of November 2022 and Measure Z. And therefore we were introducing this idea for the first time. We tested potential elements, and I'm going to demonstrate some of those a little bit later, that would help sort of not only inform the city as its requirements based on the state, but also was consistent with Yorba Linda voters' aspirational goals and priorities. We tested some legally educational permissible education to see what helped develop support for the measure. Tested voter concerns, so sort of identify what were the vulnerabilities of a potential future measure so that the city and Ryder and his team could inoculate the measure from those critiques, track awareness over time, and monitor the effectiveness of outreach efforts. And I'll be showing you that over two surveys. On the next slide, you'll kind of see the process that we typically go through. Though I will say Ryder was on the ground doing outreach before we ever got started with the baseline survey. But typically we would do an initial baseline survey, then public outreach, and usually we would do it a lot more of a lag time, longer runway than we had opportunities now, certainly with respect to research. Then we would do a tracking survey close to when the city council or the supervisors or special district board, if they were doing a measure, have to place the measure on the ballot. Typically, it's 88 days before an election, though each county may vary in terms of its requirements. And once we have that tracking survey, that's a good data points for the board, the council to determine whether they'll move forward with a particular potential measure. And then once they place it on the ballot, the organization in the city, the county special district is limited in terms of what they can do in terms of outreach, but they can still do some communication. And then, of course, the election. Next slide. A lot of this was determined, or our thinking was about local control, as you'll see shortly. As Melissa mentioned, trust is greater among local governments, be it city or county, vis-a-vis state or the federal government. And this is a question that we had asked in a survey of a few years ago, just to sort of demonstrate that they tend to trust local government for solutions over governments farther away from where they live. Next slide, please. So the first baseline survey was in March and April of 2024. We interviewed a random sample of 400 likely November 2024 voters. Next slide. And among the kinds of questions we examined were awareness, first of all, of Measure Z. As I had mentioned, the perception was everyone knows about Measure Z, and we have a lot to do to swap out voters' opinions for sort of the facts rather than the hearsay that was surrounding Measure Z. And when we asked them if they were aware of Measure Z, now this was likely November 2024 voters, 46% said yes, but only 12% said they knew a lot. Of the 46% that said they knew something, we asked them, did Measure Z pass? Only 6% were correct that it had actually failed, which really sort of indicated that there was the bulk of the majority of voters for November really didn't know very much or even anything, but they were trying to not seem like they don't know what's going on in the city. So this, yeah, we kind of know a little. So if I do the math, it was about 12% that actually knew that Measure Z had failed. And so that was a really telling piece of information moving forward, certainly for the outreach firm. And it also sort of suggested to us this is an opportunity rather than we've got a lot of work to change voters' minds. Next slide, please. We tested an initial ballot question, which was informed by the work that Tripepi Smith did with those community organizations and working closely with Nate, Allison, and their colleagues and trying to understand the requirements and also working with legal counsel. We tested this ballot question, and we have a lot of experience not only with finance measures, but also with land use measures. And so we kind of used the framing that we knew voters tended to approve, but it was consistent with the city's vision and legal requirements. We gave them this ballot question, and then next slide, we asked them if there were an election today, would they vote yes in favor or no to oppose? And you could see that at least on the initial question, it was 53% yes, 36% no, 11 were undecided. But that yes and no was soft. Only 18% said definitely yes, and 11% said definitely no. It suggested we had a lot of work to do. But if you really put in context that 24.77% had voted yes on Measure Z in 2022, that we had come a long way, even though it was soft, but there was clearly more work to do. If you can advance 2 slides, please. So among the things we tested, one more, we tested a number of, go back one, please. Sorry. We tested a number of elements that were consistent with the vision of the city, the legal requirements that we thought we might want to incorporate in that 75-word ballot title and summary. Ultimately, the ordinance fleshes it out more, but we're restricted by law, or you're restricted by law with the number of words you're allowed. And so there's no expectation that every single word is going to fit that 75 words. But I know from experience that at best, most people will read just that 75-word ballot title and summary, and that is the best communication tool, regardless of how much outreach you have. If someone's going to vote, they are going to read at least part, if not all, of that ballot question. So you will see words like limiting, retaining, protecting, particularly to Nate's earlier point, protecting the character of Yorba Linda's single-family residential neighborhood. People were of the belief that that was going to change their quality of life, that next door to their home, there would be a 5-story building or 4-story building of apartments or low-income housing that people can watch them as they do their daily routine in their household. That was nothing to be true, and therefore it was really important, even in the ballot question, to ensure that there was protection. The next slide simply demonstrates additional items that we tested, and the blue and the purple are favorable, the oranges are opposed, and you could see a lot of strong elements favored by the community that gave us the tools to work with to develop a future survey. I'm going to pass it on to Ryder, and then I'll be back in a moment.
We'll go to the next slide. So the part of this effort and the information we gathered from these surveys really helped us understand our workshops and some of the meetings we need to get through, both virtual and small groups. This invited additional questions, and we encouraged questions to be asked of us throughout this process, again, informed by some of these key questions and perceptions that we were able to deduce from the survey research. It also helped us understand maybe some misperceptions that people had from the community that we wanted to make sure we could address proactively during our information sessions. And then also one other thing that was just kind of unique and interesting was, as I mentioned before, we actually had working group members who on their own volunteership were passionate about this subject, hence they had wanted to volunteer previously, and they showed up at the various workshops and Q&A sessions to actually engage and have conversations on these particular topics and provide additional resident-driven feedback kind of to the questions and issues that were coming up. So from our perspective, that was super helpful. When Melissa talked at the beginning about trust, like in many cases, in some ways, I understand this. Like the community is going to trust a fellow resident who just volunteered their time, then they may trust the elected official that represents their community or the city government employee for whatever their reason may be. And whatever that reason is, since we were an open book and trying to be transparent on this, and we were open to engagement with the residents, we welcome that opportunity to have our resident working group members be participants in the conversation and dialogue, especially given the 12 hours of time they put into learning about these topics. Let's go to the next slide. And I think all that really speaks to my point about building a trust infrastructure, which meant we were consistently providing frequent updates to the community throughout this process. We had a transparent timeline we were operating off of, which was pretty clear by the timeline we had with HCD to get through the process, and knowing that we had a ballot measure timeline that we had to execute on with the July vote to even send it to the ballot for a November 2024 ballot measure time. Everything we worked on, we produced and published with online materials through the website. We were honest about expressing trade-offs and that these were not just choices. I'm always concerned when you promise the sky and that everything's going to be amazing without at least acknowledging that, yeah, there's trade-offs. We are going to have to increase density. Are we excited about that density? No, not particularly. Are we going to work to mitigate it? Absolutely. So that it doesn't negatively impact the existing residents. But to just acknowledge there wouldn't be any negative impacts, I think is not how you build trust. And finally, we just wanted to make sure we treated our residents as partners in this process, because ultimately, as city staff, as a city, the goal was to help our residents be successful in navigating these policy issues. The community members were not the obstacle. They were the partners in trying to solve this problem, because they're the ones who have to live with the consequences of the policy decisions that they were being forced to make by the state of California. So that ultimately did take us to round two, Measure JJ. And I believe, Richard, so we'll go to the next slide. And from this, we have some additional tracking survey work that was done by FM3 as a follow-up. And to keep in mind that this tracking survey was done after all the work that Nate and Allison and others led, doing outreach work and public engagement work throughout the process. So basically almost a 12-month period from the time we finished our resident working group, going through public hearings on the housing element plan, and then doing public engagement work about that housing element plan, concurrent with HCD approval, to then get us to the point of doing a follow-on tracking survey. Go ahead, Richard.
Right. So many of the themes that we were able to sort of identify from the previous research identified the importance of local control, protecting open space, preserving neighborhood character, and emphasizing resident developed plans. And this was integrated into our thinking in terms of not only the ballot question development, but also subsequent testing of in the follow-up surveying. Next slide, please. So in June of early and mid-June, we did another survey of 300 likely Yorba Linda November 2024 voters. You'll remember that the initial survey was in late March, early April, so that window was very small. Typically, I want a larger window because it's hard to do so much work in a short period of time. But Tripepi Smith and the city were on the ground working it so heavily that, unlike most of my experience in other jurisdictions, they really were able to start moving the needle. And the council needed fresh data because they were coming up on the timeline of when they had to decide to place it on the ballot, and they really didn't have much choice because the state is breathing down on them that they need to have their the certification of their housing elements and their RENA numbers dealt with in an exponential in a quick manner. Next slide, please. So what did we test in that next survey that was helpful? Well, one is we wanted to get a sense of whether they had read anything about the land use issues discussed in the city of Yorba Linda. And here 62% said they had heard something about it. Remember that number in terms of Measure Z was a much more modest number. And then in the next slide, we identified where they had heard that information. This is important information for the city and for Ryder's group because it tells them where they're successful in communicating out. And in fact, we were able to identify at least almost half were hearing it from two or more sources, but this identifies the kinds of sources that were being used by the city team. Next slide, please. We then tested a revised ballot title and summary based on our past findings and based on sort of the city's evaluation of where these projects could go, had to go or not go in order to fill their arena numbers. And we then, after that, said if there, there were an election on the next slide, how would you vote yes in favor or no to oppose? I'll remind you that at the last measure, which was only a couple of months before that, it was at 53% yes and 18% definitely yes. There had been movement in a very short period. And I think the fact that it's a comparatively small city, if this was the city of LA, the movement wouldn't have been as great. And the dedication by city staff and the effectiveness by Tripepi Smith in really going into the neighborhoods, all those meetings and efforts that our writers discussed really made a difference. Next slide. At the end of the day, we were able to, from the last survey, the one I just showed you, again revise the ballot question. The uh, the Measure Z question is on the top. You could see if you read it closely at your own leisure when you get this, sort of, it really doesn't speak to the issues. It just talks location. And then the bottom one really addresses the concerns, but marries them with the legal approval and also the city's vision of what they would like to do. Next slide, please. Ryder, you want to take this or you would like me?
Yeah. So thank you, Richard. I'll take
Sure.
it. So as we mentioned, when we talked about how we went from there to here, this is part of the story of how we went from there to here. Ultimately, Measure J was adopted with nearly 91% of the vote. When I was observing the election results coming in that first night, I saw the very first round of reported data, and I figured that had to be one tiny couple precincts that were highly biased in their results. And then the data just kept rolling in, and the number maintained pretty much the same throughout. This represented a 65-point increase in voter approval over 2 years, and there are 20 lessons learned that we'll be talking about today about that we've already shared and we'll be summarizing shortly that help move this needle. Ultimately, the residents moved the needle on their perception of this issue. But I think from our perspective, the city's trust fall into the arms of the residents for a citizen-driven process proved eminently helpful and effective in letting the community come up with a solution that met their needs and resulted in a usable housing element. Let's go to the next slide. From our perspective, this was the power of authentic engagement, and Melissa and ILG talk often about authentic engagement, right? This wasn't some AstroTurf effort. It was genuine grassroots effort of trying to have open, heartfelt conversations with residents and putting in the time and energy to engage in that after hours conversation and work in structured and unstructured formats to help our residents understand what was going on. We brought those residents in the process. We opened with dialogue and listened. We expressed our advice and insights where necessary or where we needed to provide expert insights and help them devise their own perspective on what the best solution was going to be. And certainly the survey data helped us understand both what concerns existed so we could marry kind of tight 17-member working group perspectives with validating it with scientifically derived resident perspective on concerns and issues and make sure that those weren't too far out of alignment, because we otherwise could have had a really biased citizen working group that had a very different perspective than the rest of the community. But instead, what we saw is these tended to be in alignment, but we had much more ability working with the working group to then get into the nuances and details of their particular concerns and understand the nature of those concerns, which proved very helpful in having this authentic engagement. Let's go on with the next slide. So ultimately, this whole effort there's some key takeaways and recognition that took place. Nate, I'll throw it to you to talk about some of the recognition.
Sure, let's jump to the next slide and we'll show some of our pictures. So we were recognized in these efforts. I'll speak on the planning and then I'll let Allison talk about the KPO award. But we were recognized by the American Planning Association, both at the Orange County section level and at the California California level, state level as well. Both of those efforts were specifically related to Measure JJ and our efforts to do our communications and outreach efforts. So that was cool. I'll let Allison touch on our other awards. She was
Just,
part of that one.
just quickly, based on the communications front. So we obviously were just very grateful to have Tripepi Smith and Richard from FM3 to help us move forward with these engagement efforts. We were awarded a certificate of excellence from Capio. Worked with Sarah at the actual conference, but we were awarded just for our engagement and outreach efforts. So we were received just an initial award for our communications and marketing for our plans, and that were consultant supported with the project budget of 75,000 or more. So I think I net the next couple slides if you want to run through the next slide. And then this one I think is back to, is this Nate?
So I think I can jump in on this one, Allison. So this is a model that local governments can replicate. Resident advisory groups work. Consider using them. Education first outreach is more authentic and should be a great starting point. You can never have enough clear and transparent messaging on those points. Surveys can guide strategy, but they are not the end game. They are a tool for data to help make decisions and understand context. I sometimes hear questions about surveys being a push poll or are designed to somehow move voters. That's not the reality of it. If it's a scientific quality survey, which is what FM3 does, they don't push anybody. They just try to gauge sentiment and understand perspective and understand where folks are at. Visuals, particularly in complex issues, are absolutely critical. And even though the city engaged in huge amounts of outreach work, you saw even in Richard's survey data, yes, there was a good chunk of people, over 60%, that were familiar with the issue as a result of all the outreach work the city invested in. But even then, you still had nearly 40% of the public that were not clear or couldn't recollect having come in contact with information. So that's just an indicator of how hard it is to break through. And as a comms guy, I just know that all too well. Next slide. Richard, I'm not sure if you want to comment on this, but these are two additional land use measures that
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah. So we worked with the city of Costa Mesa prior to working with Yorba Linda, and they, as in South Pasadena, had restrictions based on voter approved measures. In the case of Costa Mesa, they were not, because of the previous measure, they had not been able to certify any kind of housing for 2 to 4 years, and there was very little in the pipeline, and they really needed to move forward to be able to certify their housing element. That measure won by 24 votes. In the case of South Pasadena, working with Ryder there, they had a voter initiative prior that dealt with height, and that was restricting their ability to address their housing elements and their arena numbers. And in both cases, the process that Ryder has suggested and enumerated in this presentation were used in these projects. And so the point here is that it wasn't a one-off. That there is a sort of systematic, thoughtful approach to this kind of research. It's not limited to land use issues, but land use issues are sometimes much more complicated than a simple sales tax. And people really do need to understand those issues and understand it's not counter to what voters have initially told city council they would like to enact. Both can be true.
Next slide. Allison, take it away.
All right. So we did have a few key takeaways. I think you'll see here, this really was what helped Yorba Linda drive, the trust, the partnership, and really effective community engagement communication. One, authentic engagement transforms outcomes. So when residents really are genuinely involved in the shaping process, their ownership increases. And ultimately, so does their support for the final decision. Trust is earned through process, not persuasion. So people trust really what they help build. What we learned, that when we prioritize transparency and consistency throughout the project, trust becomes a natural result from that. Three, an informed community is a stronger partner. So we learned educate early, engage openly, build that trust, and plan collectively. When people really understand the why behind the work, they are better positioned to support it. And that's what we learned from our working groups. They actually became the experts in this as well. That really helped us, and they need to be able to support it leading up to and then including for any type of future ballot measure initiatives. And then four, data really strengthens engagement. So we learned that survey results and community feedback really illuminate what residents value most. So this information, it allowed us to refine our approach and really ensure that our messaging was resonating with them. And lastly, transparency really builds credibility. So by clearly, sharing these constraints, we were really clear and explained our trade-offs and communicated openly at every stage and every part of this process. We created a process that a community really can believe and share and really just trust in. I think next slide.
Back to you, Melissa.
Perfect. So quick reminder to the folks on the line, we already do have a number of questions, but if you have a question about anything you just heard or as we continue this conversation, please don't hesitate to drop it into the Q&A box that you see on your screen. But I will kick us off. I'm already starting to see some themes of the questions that are coming in. So I'm going to start with some of those. I've seen a number of questions come in surrounding the social media strategy as it relates to this. So coupled with the resident advisory committee and the surveys and the other outreach you were doing, maybe Allison, you can speak to this, or Ryder, around the social media strategy that was also coupled with this. Any thoughts or recommendations you can share there?
I'll always defer to Allison first.
I think what we created an extensive social media strategy. So week by week, oftentimes we created really trying to feel the pulse of the community at that time. So obviously it was timely information that we needed to push out that took precedent. But we also did allow commenters. So I think that there was potentially, those that have asked, like, did you turn off your comments? We did not turn off comments. We just wanted to allow full transparency. If there was a theme developing from those types of questions, then we would follow up with some type of either video, updated social media post to help drive the communication efforts that we needed, because that's at that point, we are now understanding, okay, well, this is what they have the most questions about. So we allowed full transparency and engagement at that point. Ryder?
My only other additional comment I'd make is the city had a history of spending some money on boosted social media, and we continued doing that on certain posts at key milestones to ensure widespread community familiarity. That was both on social media and when we produced educational animated videos. And by educational, I literally mean they were focused on explaining how housing elements work or how builder's remedy works. We were actually spending money on YouTube, making sure that we got targeted views within the city of Yorba Linda to just learn about those housing policies, so that when somebody found themselves at a cocktail party and they were discussing the housing element in Yorba Linda, they at least had some familiarity with the issues. Yes, as everyone should everyone should be a local government nerd.
And I think to that point, we had the buy-in from our city council really for these engagement efforts. So we created a budget. And again, to Ryder's point, we really just wanted to focus on those either key milestones, or if there was, some chatter that we noticed throughout the community, we made sure to, either dispel any rumors or really just educate them on the issue before them.
No, I love that. And so happy to hear about the educational component. I think people conflate the communications and education and engagement sometimes, and both are required to do this well, right? Make sure that your community is understanding the topics that you're trying to engage on, and then have those conversations so that you're not having conversations over their head, or that they're not going to want to or be able to engage in. So love the comments about that. And Allison, there was a couple of direct questions around social media engagement back and forth. And if I think I heard you correctly, you left the comments open on your social media platforms. and then you were looking for key themes or things like that, that then you could push out FAQs or videos on, or did you engage directly back and forth on any of that conversation?
A combination of both. So there was
Okay.
some direct engagement, but as themes evolved, we took that opportunity to really educate the community as a whole as well.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying. Um, there's a lot of questions surrounding the advisory group, the working group. So I'd love to just talk a little bit more, maybe about first some of the logistics of that, how it worked in this case, and then I know I have some experience with this too, so maybe we can talk broadly about how to form these and when to use them. But some of the questions I've seen explicitly were how the group was created? Were they recruited? Was there a broad application process? How long did that process take? So, Ryder or Nate, Allison, if you could talk a little bit about how that group was developed and maybe anything you learned from that process.
Nate or Allison,
Sure.
I'll let you guys cover it.
Yeah, you want me to? I'll
Please.
kick that off. So, I mean, quite frankly, we started so there's no application process. City staff was the one that selected individuals or invited individuals to participate. Quite frankly, we started with our most vocal opponents to Measure Z, and thought that it would be beneficial to bring them into the conversation and have them participate. We didn't only want opponents to be part of it, so we also just reached out to people that we've worked with over the years with the city that have participated on various issues, and reached out and invited certain individuals to participate. The goal was really just to find a handful of people, and it wasn't necessarily supposed to be 17. It was 15 to 20 individuals that might be able to dedicate their time. But primarily, we were looking for individuals who would be open-minded. Individuals who weren't so hard set in their opinions on things that they would just dominate the conversation. And so I would say that's where we started, was reaching out and extending some invitations. We had a number of people that we had hoped would participate, but just said they didn't have the time to be able to commit to that. I saw some questions about, statistical, or, I guess demographic breakdown of the group, and we weren't quite so focused on ensuring that we had, we've got a fairly homogenous community in Yorba Linda, so we don't deal with a whole lot of language barriers within the city, so that wasn't so much of an issue for us. But we did have a somewhat diverse group that was on there, not so much intentionally, because our focus was really finding individuals who were willing to dedicate the time to do a deep dive, that were open-minded on engaging in this conversation, and wanted to make sure we had opponents that were on there that could help come up with a solution. And so, Ryder, is there anything else you'd want to add to how we reached out?
No, it was, importantly, these were not council appointed. It was not a Brown Act committee. There was no defined outcome and no legal obligation on the council to take the advice of or take action on what the working group produced, if anything. So it was, I would almost describe it more of like the city wanted to have a focus group and pulled together a bunch of voices that knew were at least engaged on the housing policy issues, and therefore came in familiar, but also willing to engage in robust discussion. And then we let it rip from there. And where we ended up was organically arrived at by that group, continuing to head down a path together and identifying, like, once they felt they had knowledge of the issues and challenges, then they felt a certain ownership of how to solve this problem for their community. And that was super empowering.
And I will just add that we had working group members represented all across town. So you weren't just focused on one of the western part of the city, but from east to west, you had working group members equally represented.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we've done this in other jurisdictions, you can have an application process. We've done that with other cities, just to kind of gauge interest and to if you do have criteria, and I'll put that in quotes, that you're trying to meet, whether that's geographic diversity. In one of the projects I'm thinking of, we wanted, different age groups represented. We wanted, students and business owners, et cetera. And so we wanted to have that cross section. And so that was an easy way for us to get that information. So that's another approach you can take if you want to make sure that you're checking some of those boxes in terms of the diversity of your community. And the other thing I would add is if you don't want to go with a formalized approach like that in terms of an application, similar to when you're doing interviews or focus groups, you can always also ask the community champions or the folks that you have identified, who else should we be talking to? What other groups should we be reaching out to try to get that representation at the table as well? But thank you for that clarification. There's lots of questions about forming that. I think there's a lot of interest from this group about this. Go ahead, Ryder.
If I may, certainly
sorry, Richard.
even the survey will be representative of the community and will integrate the demographics, the potential linguistic groups, if it's beyond just English. So there are other ways to engage the community on a more macro way.
That's actually a great segue too. We had a few questions come in about surveys, and Richard, maybe you can start us off on some of these. But I'm seeing some questions around getting people to respond to surveys and making sure that they're scientifically significant. So, were there incentives offered attached to this survey? How did you go about with the distribution of it? And then a more meta question maybe for the whole group on the line is, how can we as local governments combat the survey fatigue that we know is happening when you get 12 surveys in your inbox? How can you help an agency navigate that, or what should folks be thinking about to get people to respond to the survey and get the information they need?
Sure. Well, I often will get the question, who in their right mind is going to spend 15 or 20 minutes on the phone answering a question? And yet, lo and behold, every single night we are completing hundreds and thousands of interviews. So it is doable. We have a list of all. In this case, we had a list of all registered voters and identified who were likely voters. The people who are likely voters are clearly going to be a little bit more civically engaged. We did not have an incentive. We didn't need an incentive, and they do not have a relative to some communities, they don't have as large a likely voter pool as, let's say, the city of LA or the city of Long Beach, or up north in San Francisco or San Jose. We were able to complete the sample size that we had recommended. On the online invite, we had the city manager with his signature, with the city logo, to validate the authenticity of the the survey, so that people didn't think it was, some group that was off for considering to do nefarious means with getting into their computers. And on the phone, we systematically, slowly contact folks and identify ourselves, and we give the city a protocol memo so that if someone calls to ensure that it's a legitimate survey, the folks on the front lines and the council members are aware this is happening and can validate without biasing the results. So if for folks who are worried about that, we have processes to ensure that people respond, and that we had the respondents mirror, the demographics mirror the respondents of the likely voters. And so therefore we had a significant certainty that the results would mirror the final results.
Perfect. Thank you. Anybody want to speak to that survey fatigue question? I don't know, Allison, if you've come across this, if you guys were doing multiple surveys, or Ryder, with other folks you've worked with, any thoughts on the survey fatigue challenge?
I'd probably more defer to Richard's perspective on that, because he's familiar with that particular challenge. Unless Allison, you've or Nate, you've come across that in Yorba Linda, but I don't sense you're doing more than one survey a year or so from a scientifically valid perspective.
Yeah,
Richard will defer you, but it was fairly unique. So I don't think we had that concern moving forward with the surveys in Yorba Linda.
Richard, do you have any
yeah,
comments on that?
yeah. I guess I'd want to say because there are many cities where we're constantly doing surveys. You want to spread them out. If it's large enough city, you want to avoid having the same people respond, so you can pull their identification out of the samples, so you have a new sample base in which to interview. And in some very small jurisdictions, we may recommend doing postcards as well, so that we're not only contacting folks by the telephone, both online, landlines and mostly cell phones at this point for obvious reasons, by email and by text, but also postcards also help increase the likelihood of response. And then we just slowly walk the survey so that we're not calling everyone on one night and, being very respectful of people's times, trying to schedule callbacks when it's more appropriate for them. And these methods seem to be continuing to work. It keeps me in business. And at one point we may not be, but so far, so good.
Uh, I think the other thing that I've heard from agencies or have talked through with agencies, for the less scientifically valid surveys. So if you're just talking about, oh, you're putting out a online survey to
Like
folks
a
to gather
survey
feedback
monkey or
on.
something, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the key tips to think about from your own jurisdiction is internal coordination. So you don't have your planning department and your public works department and your police department or whomever it might be all putting out surveys at the same time. So thinking about that internal coordination piece, and making sure that you're collecting that and doing it as a collective effort as possible, and also being aware of previous surveys and data that you've collected. So have you done outreach on this topic or a related topic? Have you done a survey or a workshop or something that you also can pull data from? Do you need to do that next survey, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So thinking about that internal coordination piece, which Richard, I think you were also alluding to in terms of making sure that your team is all on the same page and coordinating and making sure that you're not putting things out back to back.
Right, but I would worry about those convenience surveys because anyone can take it. In some cases, if you're not watching their IP addresses or taking it multiple times, it's not necessarily a reflection of the community, and you can get a skewed response because people who are very engaged in that topic, if I want a swimming pool because my kids are swimmers, I'm answering that survey 100 times because, yeah, you'll know someone wants that swimming pool.
Well, and they'll go tell the swim team to all
That's
respond
right.
to the survey too.
That's
So
right.
I would agree. Like, I just want to emphasize that point, Melissa, which is there are scientifically valid surveys, and then there are survey monkeys and Google Forms and whatnot, which we use those too. But I'm always very explicit with my team, and when I talk to my clients, those are feedback forms. So that's organized feedback. But if they call it a survey, I will wince and give them a face of pain. And I will say, God help me, if you try to take that and turn it into a bar chart or a pie chart, like that implies a certain level of data accuracy to what was conveyed, which is just not healthy because it's not really true. So you have to be very careful with that.
No, I appreciate the clarity on the words that we're using, because there's a place for all of those things.
Absolutely.
But definitely, Ryder, hear you loud and clear and agree in terms of understanding the information that you're getting from those different types of inputs, right? And the distinction between a survey you're going to run in-house through SurveyMonkey and something that is going to be statistically significant.
Yeah. Thanks for indulging me on my little rant there, but I've
No,
experienced it many a
very
time.
good point. Okay, let me glance at these questions. So obviously the survey was a big piece of the data collection here, but Ryder, and Allison and Nate, to your points, there was also broader outreach and engagement in this process and in a lot of processes. So any advice or thoughts on the balance between in-person and virtual? So we obviously made this huge pendulum swing during the pandemic and went virtual and have figured out how to do all of these things online, right? And now there's obviously also a desire to come back in person. So how are you all balancing those two types of engagement efforts?
Do you want me to take a first crack at this, team?
Yeah.
So I love both. They each have their place. I think the in-person is particularly powerful when it comes to proving that somebody actually is in the area that's giving feedback and participating. B, the human-to-human contact of looking somebody in the eye and engaging with them is what takes advantage of local government having trust. So getting into neighborhoods, and the city was very specific. Like all the meetings we held were, yeah, we did one at the community center, but it was in City Hall, and the others were all in like HOA offices and schools and whatnot. We got out of City Hall and out into the neighborhoods. And I think that has a certain important psychological effect. And it also is just good customer service. And the city really wanted to go where the voters were or where the residents were, frankly, and have these conversations. I love online because it is easier to participate for folks who aren't particularly mobile or don't have time. And it's a great recording studio. So I can at least create an asset early on with a recording of the presentation and then the Q&A that happens, and had that as a digital asset that exists on a YouTube channel or on a website, so that folks who don't get a chance to participate in person at least have a resource to go to. So my general preference is I love to do a Zoom webinar first, so that we have the asset available as early as possible in the outreach process, and then do the in-person ones after that. It also gives a chance for the city staff and others to kind of practice a little bit in an environment that's a little easier in Zoom than in person. But it just adds and then gives us a long tail asset for the video to exist out there and refer to it as we try to bring the community along for the conversation. So I like both. They each have their advantages. And I do think there's a reason why you do one over the other initially. But if you can do both, that makes the most sense.
I will add too, Melissa, we were mindful of, reaching all the different generations. So from even community meetings, whether they're HOAs or at schools, we also offered Saturday morning coffees for members of the community to come in and chat, more informal. We hosted one at a local restaurant. So different types of communication platforms, whatever their comfort level was. So that was also, I think, helped us succeed in getting the messaging out and having those community members get on board.
No, that's exactly what we always tell folks too, is diversity in your outreach methods and communication techniques, but also Ryder, explicitly what you said too, is both, right? You want to have opportunities and different options for folks to engage and participate. And some things are cheaper than others to do. And so having kind of that cross section of engagement activities, I think is very helpful, and thinking about virtual and in person in that space.
I will add one more thing, Melissa. I think the other
Mhm.
part is this is a complicated topic. So I think when we brought Ryder and his team on, really coming up with some educational pieces was helpful. So if you had 3 hours, or if you had 15 seconds to glance over a quick FAQ flyer, we provided those opportunities for residents to be engaged that way as well.
Yes, different. People have different amounts of time to engage with you, right? And so how can you get that message off quickly? Or for folks who really want to sink their teeth into it, how do you have that bigger conversation? Hoping we have time for maybe one more quick question before we wrap up. And I do want to acknowledge, I know we didn't get to everybody's questions. We had a lot come in, and so I will also share contact information so you all can follow up as you would like. But I've seen a couple of questions come through around how to make this budget friendly. So any thoughts on how agencies can either do this in-house, or if there's I know that there has historically been some planning money available to help do some of this, but if you want to specifically, Nate, maybe respond to how you all paid for some of this, but
Yeah.
also just generally, if you all have tips on how to do this in a budget-friendly manner.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would just point out that we recognize that there was an opportunity cost for failure. So if this failed, we knew that the state would have the ability to charge us as a penalty of up to $600,000 per month for failing, and that was not something that we could do. So there was a bit of a spare no expense mentality with this, and you know, we did try and do it as budget friendly as we could, but we did recognize the other side of the coin on this. I point out too that we did take advantage of several grants that were made available through the state HCD. So like the REAP 1.0, there was another one prior to that. I can't remember the name of it, but you know, several regional grants that were made available that we knew this effort was going to be something that we would need to do, and we leveraged that and in order to get there. And then, yeah, like you mentioned, we did plan for it in a budget as well, to cover any additional expense on top of that. So that was sort of the way that we approached that.
I would just observe engagement does not scale well. And by that, I mean, whether you have 10,000 people or 50,000 people or 100,000 people, it still takes the same amount of effort to host a community workshop. You might save on your mailing costs if you're doing a mailer to get people to attend, because instead of a mail to 50,000 households, you mail to 2,500. But ultimately, showing up, being present, being well-informed, speaking to the issues, having a solid PowerPoint deck, recording the session, having the AV, it is what it is. And that is not inexpensive to pull off. And whether you're doing it with in-house staff or you're doing it with a consultant, it's still time, effort, and energy to make that happen. So that is one just hard reality of scale and trying to pull these things off. So when you go to look at your cost divided by your total population, or maybe divided by the number of voters, you know, you can look at anywhere from $5 to $20 per vote voter, just in terms of like communication effort and energy to get it done. But I think Nate raises an interesting point, is what is the consequence of not having effective engagement on the issue, and what will that cost be? The city spent far less than $600,000 on this effort, which would have been 1 month of fines had the effort failed at its penultimate or at its pinnacle of fining by the state of California to make this work. So, and I often remind agencies these days that the opportunity cost of not having good engagement on a big, audacious project is you get it to the dais after spending hundreds of thousands of staff hours and energy to get it there, and it dies in the dais because of misunderstanding, misinformation, or a public who's ill prepared to accept that project.
Thank you. That very, very valid decision points and internal conversations to have with your team on the trade-offs and what happens if you don't go through these processes, and what can you do in-house versus what might you need consultants for, et cetera. And yeah, for this particular topic, yeah, the LEAP and REAP and SB2 funds were great sources for planning dollars for agencies. So keeping your eyes out for funds and grant funds that might allow you to do some of this is also a great tip, but they're not always available, unfortunately. So definitely some things to think about as you're planning your next process. So I know we're at time. I just want to share a couple of closeout things with you all. Just a quick plug for ILG. If you're not on our mailing list or connected with us on our social media channels, we share a lot of information, upcoming trainings, et cetera, through these channels. So please connect with us that way. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have been recording, and we will share the recording and the slide deck and some of the resources that we mentioned here with you all via email in the next few days. Just a couple of resources to share with you from ILG's perspective too. As you're thinking about public engagement, we have what we call our TIERS framework, which stands for Think, Initiate, Engage, Review, and Shift. And it's a thorough template for you guys all to think about in terms of engagement processes. And there's a number of templates and other resources, sample facilitation plans, community landscaping exercises, et cetera. And this is all on our website and available for you all to access if you're interested ahead of your next engagement process. And we also do training in this space. So we talked a lot about community workshops and things like that. We have a 2-day training that we do for local governments, staff and officials on meeting design and facilitation. And so registration for our next training in March is open now. So if you click that link or scan that QR code, that will get you more information. But our goal is to really help set you up for success. I did see some questions come in about how do you prevent people from taking over your meetings and the grandstanding and things like that. And this is some of the topics that we cover in that training around how to design your meeting to achieve the goals you're looking for. And as promised, here's contact information for myself and the team on the line right now. As I mentioned, I know we didn't get to all of your questions, so please don't hesitate to ping me as follow-up or our esteemed panelists with questions that we didn't have time for today. So I just want to thank all of my panelists for joining me and sharing their expertise and thoughts on this topic. And thank you to our attendees for sharing part of your afternoon with us. I'd want to give my panelists just a second to say any final thoughts. If you have any, Richard, Ryder, Nate, or Allison, any thoughts before we let everyone go?
Lots of great questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all, but please email us if you have additional ones. We're happy to answer them. And as always, amazing job, ILG. Thank you so much for what you guys do for local government.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. My one piece of advice that hasn't been said is start as early as you can. Don't wait. Don't wait. There's too much work to be done.
It's great advice. Okay. All right. Well, with that, we'll let you go for the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much. And we hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.